On the 20th spring, Samuel filled the bucket like he always did, and for the first time in his life, no one came to drink from it. He stood at the edge of his porch until the light went orange, then gray, then gone. The fruit he had set out that morning, mangoes still warm from the tree, sat untouched in a woven basket by the fence post. Somewhere past the tree line, in the direction of the reserve, a fish eagle called twice and did not call again. Samuel was 82 years old, and in 82 years, he had learned that silence has different weights. This one sat on his chest like a stone. He told himself it meant nothing. Animals were late sometimes. Rivers flooded, paths shifted, an old bull elephant could decide, in whatever private calendar he kept, that this particular morning was not the morning. Samuel had told himself this every spring for the better part of 2 decades. And every spring, by noon at the latest, he had heard the particular sound of the acacia branches parting that meant his friend had arrived. He had heard that sound so many times, he no longer needed to look up to know it. He knew it the way he knew his own front door. He did not hear it that day. He did not hear it the next day either. By the 3rd morning, the fruit in the basket had begun to draw flies, and Samuel had stopped pretending he was simply waiting. He was watching the tree line the way a man watches a hospital corridor, and he understood, with the particular clarity that comes to the very old, that something on the other side of that tree line had gone wrong, and that he was going to have to go and find out what. What he did not know yet, could not have known yet, standing on that porch with a bucket of water going warm in the sun, was that his friend had not forgotten him. He had not grown old and wandered off to die alone the way old bulls sometimes do. He had made a choice, the same kind of choice Samuel himself had made once, a lifetime ago, and it would take Samuel walking further into the wilderness than his doctor would have permitted, and further than his own body wanted to carry him, to understand exactly what that choice had cost. The story the whole district would eventually tell, the one photographers had already spent 2 decades trying to capture in a single frame, had never really been about an elephant visiting an old man once a year. It had always been about what one living thing will do to protect another. Samuel simply did not know yet that the story was about to ask that question of him directly. The village called it a friendship before Samuel ever did. He preferred, back then, the word arrangement, because arrangement did not require him to explain something he could not explain. It had started the spring after Miriam died, in a year that Samuel still measured his life against the way other men measure their lives against wars. Miriam had been gone 11 weeks. The farmhouse still smelled like the lavender water she used to boil on the stove, because Samuel had not been able to make himself stop boiling it, even alone, even for no one. He was 62 that year, not yet old the way he would come to think of old, but old enough that the neighbors had begun dropping by with casseroles, and the particular tone of voice people use with widowers they expect to find dead in a chair one morning. He did not blame them. Some mornings he expected it too. He was out near the fence line at first light, doing the kind of chore a man invents for himself when he cannot bear an empty house, when he saw the calf. It could not have been more than 2 years old, small enough still to be dwarfed by the termite mounds it stood beside, and it was alone in a way that made the hair rise on Samuel's arms before his mind caught up to why. Elephants are not meant to be alone. He knew that much even then, before the reserve rangers taught him the rest of it. A calf alone means a herd in crisis, or a calf that has been pushed out, or worse. It took him 4 days to understand what had happened, most of it pieced together from a young ranger named Naledi Malangu, who had been patrolling that stretch of the boundary, and who found Samuel standing at his fence at dawn for the 3rd morning running, watching a young elephant that would not leave. The calf's mother had died in a snare 2 months earlier. Naledi told him, one of the crude wire loops poachers set for bushmeat that catch elephants and buffalo as often as the antelope they are meant for. The herd had tried, for a while, to absorb the orphan, the way elephant herds sometimes do. It had not taken. Herds under pressure, Naledi explained, do not always have room for one more slow, small, grieving thing to protect. The calf had drifted to the edge of the group, and then off it entirely, and had wandered, alone and underfed, until it found itself standing outside a dying woman's rose garden, in front of a man who understood, better than he wanted to, exactly what it felt like to have been left standing somewhere by loss with no idea how to leave. Samuel did not tell Naledi that part. He did not tell anyone that part for years. He put water out because it seemed like the only thing a person could do that would not make things worse. He did not expect the calf to drink from a bucket set by a human hand. Wild things do not do that. Not this wild, not this recently orphaned. But grief does strange things to caution. In elephants the same as in men, and the calf drank, and came back the following week, thinner still, but coming back. And by the 3rd month, Samuel had stopped pretending to himself that this was an accident of geography, and started admitting it was something closer to companionship. Miriam would have said the elephant knew a fellow mourner when it smelled one. Samuel, who did not believe in things like that, believed it anyway, quietly, the way he believed most of what Miriam used to say after she was no longer there to say it. It was Miriam's voice, in fact, that he heard most clearly the day the calf first accepted fruit directly from his hand instead of the basket. She had died before any of it happened, but he heard her anyway, the way you hear a person whose voice you spent 40 years memorizing. She used to keep 2 buckets by the kitchen door, always, even in years when it was only the 2 of them and no reason for it. When he had asked her once why, she had told him that you never truly know how many will come looking for water on a given day, and that it costs a man nothing to fill an extra bucket, and it costs him everything if he doesn't have one ready when it's needed. He had thought it a strange, sentimental habit at the time. He kept doing it after she died because stopping felt like one more small death. And some years later, standing at that fence with an orphaned calf, drinking from a bucket that should have been hers, he understood for the first time that she might not have been talking about water at all. The calf grew. Elephants do faster than people expect, and within 3 years, the animal that had once been small enough to hide behind a termite mound stood taller than Samuel's fence and had begun to develop the particular carriage of a young bull who has decided, on some private timeline of his own, that it is time to leave the safety of whatever herd or human had raised him and go find out what the rest of the world is like. Samuel had expected that. Every rancher and ranger in the district had told him it was coming. What he had not expected was for the bull, once grown, once gone off to live the solitary roaming life of adult males in that ecosystem, to come back. He came back the following spring, on almost the same date, and stood at the fence the way he had as a calf, only now he was enormous. Over 3 meters at the shoulder, the kind of animal that made grown rangers stop their vehicles and reach for radios out of instinct before their brains caught up with what they were seeing. He did not ask for anything. He did not damage the fence or raid the vegetable patch the way wild bulls sometimes do when hungry. He simply stood, patient as a held breath, until Samuel came out with the same bucket, the same basket of fruit, and something in the animal's stance that Samuel would later describe, when pressed by journalists he mostly avoided, as recognition. Not friendliness exactly. Something with more weight to it than friendliness. He gave the bull a name that sprang, quietly, to no one but himself. He called him Unkosi, the word his farmhand's grandmother had used for chief, because there was no other word that fit an animal who arrived like a debt being paid. For 17 years after that first return, Kosi came back every spring on a date that drifted by no more than a day or 2 either direction, walked the 20 miles from deep inside the reserve to a fence line outside a small isolated farmhouse, drank water from a bucket, ate fruit from a basket, stood near an old man for a few hours in a silence that neither of them seemed to need to fill, and then turned and walked the 20 miles back. Word travels slowly in that part of the district, and then all at once. For the first few years, it was only neighbors who knew, the kind of local curiosity that gets mentioned at the feed store and nowhere else. Then a school teacher from the next town over brought her class out on a spring morning to see it for themselves. And one of the children's fathers worked for a regional newspaper. And after that, the fence line outside Samuel's farmhouse was never quite as quiet as it had been. Wildlife photographers began arriving from 3 continents, hoping to catch the reunion in a single frame, setting up blinds a respectful distance away and waiting sometimes for days on the strength of a rumor about the date. University researchers proposed theories about scent memory and imprinting and the well-documented long memory of elephants, theories that were probably all partly true, and that none of them, including the researchers, found fully satisfying. One team spent an entire season attempting to fit the relationship into a framework built for studying imprinted orphans and left, in the end, without publishing anything, because the senior researcher admitted privately to Naledi that the data kept behaving like something the framework had no category for. Samuel gave the same answer to every camera crew that asked him to explain it. Some friendships don't need words, he told them, and then went back inside, because he had never once, in 17 years, felt the need to explain it any further than that to anyone, including himself. He let the photographers photograph. He let the school children come, twice a year, and stand well back from the fence with their teachers while he filled the bucket. He never let anyone film the part of the visit that happened after the cameras usually lost interest. The hour or more when the 2 of them simply stood, an old man and an old bull, close enough to touch, not touching, in a silence that had nothing left in it that needed proving to a lens. What none of them knew, what Samuel had never told a single reporter, was that he still kept 2 buckets by the door. He had never needed the second one. Not once, in all those years, had Nkosi arrived with company, until he stopped arriving at all. Samuel left 3 days after the fruit in the basket began to draw flies. He told no one his plan except Naledi, who had gone from a young ranger patrolling a border to the reserve's senior warden over the 2 decades of their acquaintance, and who told him, in the flat voice of someone who already knows an argument is lost, that a man of 82 years old had no business walking into 11,000 hectares of wilderness on foot to search for one elephant among an unknown number. Samuel told her that Nkosi had walked 20 miles a year for 17 years to see him, and that the least a man could do in return was walk however many it took to find out if his friend was alive. Naledi did not win the argument. She did what a good warden does when she cannot win an argument, and came with him instead, along with a young tracker named Saifo, who had grown up in a village bordering the reserve and who could read a game trail the way other men read newspapers. Word of the old man's plan moved through the village faster than Samuel expected, and by the time he was ready to leave, 6 neighbors had appeared at his gate uninvited, the way people do in a place small enough that everyone's business is quietly everyone's business. One brought dried meat and a full jerry can of water lashed to the back of his bicycle. Another, a woman whose grandmother had been the one to first tell Samuel the story of an animal that never forgets a kindness, pressed a small folded cloth into his hand at the last moment and would not explain what it was for, only that he should keep it close. A third simply shook Samuel's hand for longer than a handshake usually lasts and said nothing at all, which Samuel understood better than words would have managed. Nobody in that village had ever needed the anniversary explained to them. They had watched it happen every spring of their lives. They left before dawn on the 4th day, following the general bearing of the route Nkosi had always taken in reverse, toward the deep bush veld where the reserve's elephant populations concentrated during the dry months. The first 2 days produced almost nothing, and almost nothing, Samuel would learn, is its own kind of torment when a man's legs are 82 years old and his mind will not stop counting the hours since anyone last saw his friend alive. Old dung, weak stale. A watering hole trampled by a herd that had moved through some time ago and was long gone by the time they reached it, the mud at its edges already cracking in the heat. Once, on the first afternoon, Sifo went very still mid-stride and raised a closed fist. The tracker's signal for stop, and the three of them stood motionless for nearly a full minute while something large moved through thick brush 40 meters to their left and never showed itself. It was not, Sifo said afterward, in a voice pitched carefully calm for Samuel's benefit, the kind of movement an elephant makes. Nobody asked him to elaborate on what kind of movement it had been instead. Sifo found one set of tracks on the second afternoon that made him crouch and go very still for a long moment before saying anything, and when Samuel asked what was wrong, the young tracker pointed to a patch of disturbed earth beside the print and said one word: wire, a snare, sprung and empty, whatever it had caught, either torn free or dragged off some time before. The wire itself still coiled loosely in the dirt like something sleeping. Now Lady's face did something Samuel had not seen it do before, a controlled kind of fear that professionals learn to keep off their faces and mostly succeed at, mostly. She photographed the snare, bagged it, and did not say out loud what all three of them were now thinking, which was that a discarded snare this deep inside the reserve meant someone had walked this exact ground recently enough that the wire had not yet rusted. That night, camped beside a dry riverbed under a sky so full of stars it made Samuel feel, not for the first time in his life, appropriately small. Naledi radioed in the coordinates of the snare to the reserve's central office and received, in return, a report that kept her awake long after Samuel and Sifo had gone quiet in their bedrolls. A ranger patrol on the western boundary, nearly a full day's walk from where they now sat, had logged 2 separate sightings that week of a vehicle that did not belong to any registered tour operator or research team, moving along a disused service track after dark with its headlights off. Naledi did not mention the report to Samuel until morning. There was, she reasoned, nothing useful he could do with the information at midnight except lie awake with it, and she suspected, correctly, that he would do that regardless of when she told him. It was on the 4th day, deep in a stretch of mopane woodland that Samuel had never walked in 17 years of waiting at his fence, that Sifo stopped so abruptly that Samuel nearly walked into him. The prints were fresh. Samuel did not need Sifo to tell him that, though Sifo told him anyway, crouching to press 2 fingers into the edge of the impression, checking how quickly the loose soil had begun to crumble back into the shape. A large bull, moving with purpose, not the wandering gait of an animal grazing, but the straighter, more deliberate stride of one going somewhere specific. Samuel recognized the size of the print the way he might have recognized a signature. He had stood beside that exact foot, close enough to touch it, more mornings than he could count. And beside it, smaller, lighter, pressed less deeply into the earth, were 2 more sets of tracks, calf-sized, fresh as the bull's. Samuel stood over those tracks for a long time without speaking. Now Lady would say later that she had never, in all her years in the field, watched a grown man's face do quite what Samuel's face did in that moment, some complicated collision of relief and confusion and a grief that had not yet had anywhere to go, and suddenly did not know where to go now that it had been proven unnecessary. He was alive. Whatever had kept Nkosi from that fence line was not death, but an elephant who had spent 17 years walking away from every other obligation each spring to keep one appointment did not simply choose, this one year, not to come. Something had made the choice for him. They followed the tracks for another 6 hours, deeper into a part of the reserve that even Naledi visited rarely, terrain broken by dry riverbeds and stands of thorny scrub where visibility dropped to almost nothing. It was Sifo who saw him first, or rather saw the shape of him through a gap in the mopane, a shape too large and too still to be anything else. He raised a hand, and the three of them stopped, and Samuel felt something in his chest that he had not felt since the morning he identified Miriam at the small district hospital, a feeling too large for the word relief. Nkosi stood in a small clearing near a mostly dry riverbed, and he was not alone. Two calves stood pressed against his flank, small enough that they could have been born no more than a few months earlier, curious and unafraid in the particular way of very young animals who have not yet learned what to be afraid of. One of them extended its trunk toward a low branch and then thought better of it and retreated back against the bull's leg, watching the humans in the clearing with an attention that seemed, to Samuel, disconcertingly familiar. Samuel understood, looking at them, why his friend had not come. A bull that fathers calves does not typically remain near them, the way Nkosi was clearly remaining, close enough to touch, angled always so that his own bulk stood between the calves and whatever direction he judged to be the greater danger. Adult male elephants are usually solitary, drifting through the lives of females and calves only briefly. This was something else, something Naledi would later describe to a university researcher as behaviorally unusual enough to merit its own paper, though what she did not say to the researcher, and what she did say quietly to Samuel that evening, was that she had a private theory that had nothing to do with published behavioral science. She thought Nkosi remembered exactly what it was to be a calf standing alone at the edge of a herd with no one between him and the world. She thought he had decided, in whatever way an elephant decides things, that no calf under his protection was ever going to have to learn that particular lesson. He had not abandoned the tradition of 20 miles and a bucket of water. He had chosen, this one year, a different obligation, one that could not wait even one afternoon, even for an old friend. What none of them yet understood, standing in that clearing in the gathering heat of the afternoon, was that the danger Nkosi had positioned his whole enormous body against was not a lion, and it was not a hyena, and it was not any of the predators that instinct alone would have prepared him for. It was already inside the boundary of the reserve, and it was closer than any of them knew. Naledi's radio crackled that evening with a report that made her go very still in exactly the way Samuel had come to recognize, and this time she did not try to keep her face professional in front of him. A ranger patrol on the eastern boundary, nearly 9 kilometers from where they were camped, had found the remains of a fresh camp, cold ashes still faintly warm, tire tracks leading to a service road that had no business having tire tracks on it, and a set of tools that any experienced warden recognizes on sight and never wants to see: wire cutters, a saw with teeth designed for bone, not wood, 2 spent rifle cartridges that did not match anything the reserve's own anti-poaching unit carried. Ivory poachers had crossed into the reserve, and based on the direction of the tire tracks and the timing, they had been operating in this general area for at least 10 days. Long enough, Naledi said quietly, to explain why an experienced bull with 2 young and vulnerable calves had abandoned every other pattern of his life to keep himself between his family and the part of the bush where the danger was thickest. Samuel did not sleep much that night. He sat outside the small ranger tent with a blanket around his shoulders that Sifo had insisted he take, listening to the particular silence of a wilderness that was not actually silent at all, full of the small sounds of things moving and calling and going about the business of survival. And he thought about a rose garden 18 years ago and a lonely calf standing beside it. He had been 62 that spring, and he had believed, with the specific certainty of a man freshly widowed, that he had nothing left to protect and therefore nothing left to lose. Miriam had died on a Tuesday in the same bedroom where she had been born, in a farmhouse that had belonged to her family for 3 generations before it belonged to him by marriage. And Samuel had spent the 11 weeks that followed doing the small mechanical tasks of a life he no longer felt attached to, because stopping the small mechanical tasks felt like the last thread connecting him to being a person who did things. He had not expected an orphaned calf to need him. He had not expected, at 62, to discover that he still had something in him capable of being needed. What he understood now, sitting outside a tent in the reserve at 82 years old, was that Nkosi had likely understood something similar, in his own way, at whatever age elephants come to understand such things. That protecting something is not always a choice you consciously make. Sometimes it is simply what is left of you, once everything else has been stripped away, the last instinct standing when all the others have gone quiet. Samuel had built a friendship out of that instinct once. Now his friend was doing the same thing, and there were men in the bush with rifles and bone saws who did not care what it had cost either of them to get there. He thought of the 2 buckets by his kitchen door, filled every spring for 17 years, for an animal who never once needed the second one. And for the first time he wondered whether Miriam's old habit had not been sentiment at all, but something closer to a kind of faith, the quiet, stubborn faith of a person who keeps a place set at the table for someone who has not yet arrived, because she believes, without evidence, that eventually they will. He fell asleep near dawn, still turning the thought over, and woke to the sound of Naledi's voice, low and urgent, already on the radio. The poachers had been located, and they were moving toward the riverbed where Nkosi and the calves had bedded down for the night. What happened over the following 18 hours would be told, in one version or another, in every village within 30 kilometers of the reserve, for years afterward, though the version Samuel himself told, on the rare occasions he told it at all, was always shorter than everyone else's and always ended in the same place. Naledi's anti-poaching unit mobilized within the hour, 4 rangers and a tracking dog moving fast along the service road the poachers had used to enter, while the second team looped wide to try to cut off the most likely escape route toward the reserve's eastern fence. Samuel was told, in no uncertain terms, to remain at the ranger camp. He did not remain at the ranger camp. He would say later that he did not decide to follow them so much as discover an hour in that his legs had already made the decision without consulting the rest of him. Saifo, given the unenviable job of keeping an 82-year-old man from getting himself killed in the bush, walked beside him the whole way, and would say afterward, to anyone who asked, that he had never in his life seen a man that age move that fast, and that he had stopped somewhere around the second hour, trying to talk him into turning back. They caught up to the edge of the operation as the light was beginning to fail, in time to see, from a low ridge above the dry riverbed, a scene that Samuel would spend the rest of his life not fully describing to anyone. 3 men moving through the brush below with rifles held low and ready, spread in a loose line, clearly experienced, clearly working the wind, so their scent would not carry ahead of them toward their target. They move the way men move when they have done this before and expect to do it again, unhurried, methodical, checking the ground for the particular churned earth and broken branches that mean a large animal has passed recently. One of them stopped every few dozen meters to look through a pair of binoculars toward the tree line, and each time he did, Samuel felt Sifo's hand tighten fractionally on his arm, a silent instruction to not move, not even to breathe louder than necessary. Below them, in the clearing by the riverbed, Nkosi stood rigid and enormous. Ears flared wide in the universal elephant signal of a threat assessment underway, positioned exactly where Samuel had seen him the day before, between his calves and the world. He had heard them before the rangers had. Elephants hear things humans cannot, low-frequency vibrations traveling through the ground itself, and something in his stance told Samuel that the animal had known these men were coming for longer than any of the humans converging on that clearing realized. He had not run. Running, with 2 calves too young to move quickly through broken terrain, would have meant leaving distance he could not afford to leave. He had stayed and stood, and waited, the way he had waited every spring at a fence line. Except this time the thing he was waiting for was a threat instead of an old man with a bucket of water. What happened next unfolded in less time than it takes to describe it, and in far more detail than Samuel could ever bring himself to recount in full. A shot, close enough that the sound of it seemed to arrive from inside his own chest rather than from the riverbed below. Naledi's team breaking from cover with the particular controlled violence of people trained for exactly this moment, shouting warnings that the poachers committed now did not heed. A second shot, and this one Samuel watched land, watched the great animal stagger and not fall, watched him turn his enormous body not toward escape, but more fully toward his calves, absorbing whatever came next between them and it. Sifo would say afterward that he had physically restrained Samuel from going over the ridge, that the old man had moved toward the gunfire, the way another man might move toward his own child, and that it had taken every bit of strength Sifo had to hold him back from a slope no 82-year-old body could safely descend under fire. Samuel did not remember trying. He remembered only the sound and the sight of his friend still standing, wounded, still standing, and a silence afterward that seemed to last far longer than the seconds it actually occupied. The exchange that followed between the Rangers and the poachers lasted less than 3 minutes. It ended with one poacher wounded and in custody. 2 others fled into the bush toward a road where a second reserve vehicle would intercept them before nightfall, and a reserve warden radioing for an emergency veterinary team while she knelt in the dirt beside an animal that outweighed her by 4 tons and had just taken a rifle round through the meat of his shoulder, trying to shield 2 calves who were, by some fortune that Naledi would later call the only real luck of the whole operation, entirely untouched. Samuel reached the clearing perhaps 10 minutes after the last shot, moving faster than Sifo could keep up with, and what he found there he would describe. On the single occasion he agreed to describe it at all, not as fear, but as something closer to recognition. Nkosi down on his side in the dust of the dry riverbed, breathing in the heavy labored way of an animal in shock, one massive shoulder dark and wet, in a way Samuel made himself look directly at rather than away from. And beside him, refusing every attempt by the Rangers to gently move them back, 2 calves pressed against their father's flank, exactly as they had been pressed against it the day before, too young to understand what had happened, and too instinctively bonded to leave. Samuel walked into that clearing and sat down in the dirt beside a bleeding, half-conscious elephant, close enough that Naledi's veterinary colleague, arriving 40 minutes later by helicopter with a case of emergency supplies, would find an old man with his hand resting flat against the animal's side, saying nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed to be said that the hand did not already say better. The wound, the veterinarian would confirm after a tense examination under torchlight, had missed the artery by a margin. She described as fortunate rather than miraculous, though everyone present privately thought the word she was avoiding. Deep, painful, requiring immediate treatment and weeks of monitoring, but not fatal, provided infection could be kept at bay in a wilderness with no hospital for 80 kilometers in any direction. It would be, Naledi told Samuel quietly as the medical team worked through the night under floodlights run off a generator. The kind of recovery that depended as much on the animal simply choosing to survive as it did on any medicine they could give him. Samuel did not leave the clearing for 4 days. He slept, when he slept at all, on a cot the Rangers set up 20 feet from where Nkosi lay, close enough to hear every change in the animal's breathing, and he found himself, more than once in the small hours, reaching into his pocket for the small folded cloth the woman at his gate had pressed into his hand and never explained. He unfolded it on the second night by torchlight and found inside a pressed flower from a plant Miriam used to grow along the fence, the kind that only bloomed in early spring. He did not know how the woman had known to give it to him, or whether she had known at all, or whether it was simply the kind of coincidence a tired old man allows himself to read as something more. He kept it in his shirt pocket for the rest of the vigil regardless. Sifo brought him food he mostly did not eat, and sat with him in silences that the younger man seemed, to Samuel's quiet gratitude, entirely comfortable holding without needing to fill. Naledi brought him updates on the 2 poachers who had been caught, both now in the custody of the Regional Wildlife Crimes Unit, and on the ivory trafficking network the arrests had begun to unravel, a network that had apparently been probing the reserve's eastern boundary for weeks, looking for exactly the kind of solitary, high-value bull that Nkosi, with his impressive tusks and his newly complicated devotion to 2 calves, had unfortunately become. Back in the village, word of the standoff had already outpaced the facts, growing in the retelling the way such things do, though Naledi noted with some private amusement that for once the exaggerations were not far from true. On the 5th morning, Nkosi stood. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of triumph, the way Samuel had half expected, half hoped for, after 4 days of vigil. The animal simply slowly, in stages that took the better part of an hour, shifted his weight and gathered his enormous legs beneath him and rose, unsteady at first and then less so, while the 2 calves circled him with the particular anxious energy of a very young checking that a parent is still, in fact, present and intact. He did not approach Samuel. He was not strong enough yet, and the instinct that had kept him standing between his family and every threat for the past 10 days had not entirely released its grip. But he turned his head once in Samuel's direction and held it there for longer than an animal, simply surveying its surroundings, holds anything. And Samuel, who had never in 17 years needed anyone to explain what a look like that meant, understood it perfectly. The recovery took most of the remaining dry season. For the first few weeks, Nkosi barely moved beyond the shade of a single stand of trees near the riverbed, the calves grazing in widening circles around him as his strength slowly returned, never straying far enough to lose sight of him. A veterinary team returned twice more to check the wound, each visit requiring the kind of careful, patient approach that only years of field experience makes possible with an animal that size and that wary. And each time Samuel insisted on being present, sitting a respectful distance away so as not to add his own scent and presence to an already stressful procedure, but close enough that Nkosi's eyes would sometimes find him and hold there for a moment before returning to the humans doing the actual work. Once he was strong enough to travel the distance safely, Nkosi and the 2 calves were relocated deeper into the protected core of the reserve, an area with denser ranger patrols, and further from any boundary a poacher's vehicle could easily reach. Naledi's unit, working from the intelligence gathered in the arrests, dismantled 2 more elements of the trafficking network before the season was out, work that made the regional news in a way the reserve's warden found almost, though not quite, sufficient compensation for what it had cost to get there. She would say, when a journalist eventually asked her to summarize the whole affair for a wire service piece that ran with a photograph of Samuel and Nkosi from years earlier, that the story people wanted to tell was about a miracle, and the story she had actually lived through was about a snare line, a stubborn old man, and a great deal of very ordinary, exhausting work by people who did that work every day without anyone writing about it. She said this without bitterness. She simply thought both things could be true at once, and that the second one deserved saying out loud occasionally. Samuel went home. He filled a bucket that first morning back, from habit more than expectation, and stood at the fence for a while in a silence that had, for the first time in 20 years, an entirely different quality to it. Not empty. Waiting. He did not see Nkosi again that year. The distance was too great now, the recovery too recent. The danger, however, diminished. Not yet diminished enough for Naledi to feel comfortable letting an injured bull with 2 dependent calves make a 20-mile journey through territory that had so recently proven itself unsafe, Samuel understood. He had spent 4 days with his hand against that animal's side, learning exactly how much understanding he was capable of when it came to what this particular friend needed. He kept filling the bucket anyway, every morning, out of the same stubbornness that had kept Miriam filling 2 of them, for reasons she never fully explained, even to him. Some habits, he had come to believe, are not really about the thing they appear to be about. They are a way of telling the world what you intend to still be true, whether or not the world has yet caught up to agreeing with you. Winter passed. A dry season broke into a wet one, and then dried again. The long, unhurried cycle of a landscape that measures time in a way that makes a single human life look briefer than it feels while you are living it. Samuel turned 83 in a season that felt, for the first time in a long while, less like an ending than like a held breath. Spring returned in the way it always had, the acacia along his boundary line budding out in the particular pale green that Samuel had come, over 2 decades, to associate with a very specific kind of hope. He filled the bucket that first morning, the way he always did. He set out the basket of fruit. He did not, this year, allow himself to fully believe that either would be needed, because a man who has watched an old friend nearly die does not easily return to the kind of certainty he once had. But he filled the bucket anyway, and he set out the basket, and he sat on his porch in the pale early light, the way he had sat there for 20 years, and he waited. He heard it before he saw it. The particular sound of acacia branches parting under a great weight, a sound he had told himself for 4 days in a hospital tent in the bush that he might never hear again, moving toward the farmhouse with the same unhurried, purposeful gait he had watched approach that fence for 20 years running. Samuel stood up so quickly, his chair scraped back against the porch boards, and he did not sit back down. Unkosi came through the tree line first, moving with a very slight favor in the shoulder that would likely never fully disappear, a scar visible in the morning light that Samuel would spend the rest of the story choosing not to dwell on. And behind him, close together, curious and unafraid, and considerably larger than the last time Samuel had seen them pressed against their father's side in a dry riverbed with the sound of gunfire still hanging in the air, came the 2 calves, now well into their first year, trunks already beginning to develop the particular exploratory confidence of young animals, discovering that the world this year has not tried to hurt them. Samuel did not move toward the fence right away. He stood on the porch and let them come the rest of the distance themselves, the way he had let the first calf come to him 20 years earlier, outside a rose garden that no longer existed, and for a moment it felt considerably longer than the seconds it actually occupied. He simply looked at all 3 of them in the pale morning light, the scarred shoulder, the 2 calves, the fence he had built with his own hands the summer after Miriam died. When the 3 of them finally stopped at the fence line, close enough that Samuel could see the particular scar tissue on Nkosi's shoulder and the way one of the calves kept glancing at the old man with an attention that seemed impossibly deliberate, Samuel understood that the bucket by his feet was not going to be enough. He went inside and came back with the second one, the one that had sat empty by his kitchen door for 17 years, filled every spring out of a habit he had never fully understood and had never once needed. He set it down beside the first, and one calf reached its trunk toward the water with the same cautious, hungry uncertainty Nkosi himself had shown as an orphan 2 decades before, and Samuel found himself, for the first time in a long while, unable to speak at all, which did not matter, because there had never been very much that needed saying between them in the first place. Nkosi did not drink first, the way he always had before. He waited, the way he had waited outside a riverbed for 10 days with 3 lives, depending on his patience, until both calves had finished, and only then did he lower his own trunk to the second bucket, the one that had never before had a reason to exist. That spring, for the first time in 20 years, Samuel filled 2 buckets instead of 1.